Vitaly Konstantinovich Lukoyev was born on January 15, 1956, in the North Ossetian region of the Soviet Union. By the early 2000s, he was an architect working on building projects abroad, and he was also a devoted family man. And in 1991, he married his wife, Svetlana, and together they had 2 children, a son named Konstantin and a daughter named Diana. And by 2002, Konstantin was 10 years old and Diana was 4. And they were the pride and joy of Vitaly's life. And in the summer of 2002, the Kaloyev family was living apart temporarily because of Vitaly's work, because he had been contracted for a project in Spain, and his family planned to join him there for a much-anticipated vacation. And despite the distance, they remained very close, and life was good and full of promise. Just an ordinary, happy family looking forward to the future. But on the night of July 1st, 2002, an unimaginable disaster struck Vitaly's life. Svetlana, Konstantin, and Diana were flying to meet him in Spain aboard Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937. And high above southern Germany, that passenger plane was on a collision course with a DHL cargo jet. And in the Swiss air traffic control tower, only one controller was active on duty, Peter Nielsen, who worked for Skyguide, the name of the Swiss ATC company. And Nielsen was juggling 2 radar workstations by himself, and by the time he noticed the impending danger, it was too late. And at 23:35 local time, the 2 planes collided midair over Oberlingen, Germany, erupting into fire and debris. And all 71 people on both planes were killed, including Vitaly's wife and children. And news of the Oberlingen mid-air collision devastated families across the world, but perhaps none more so than Vitaly Kaloyev, because in an instant he had lost everything: his beloved wife, his young son, and his little daughter. So Vitaly rushed to the crash site in a state of shock. And amid the wreckage, he joined recovery teams determined to find his family with his own hands. And in an extremely heartbreaking moment, Vitaly discovered a broken pearl necklace that had belonged to Diana, just a small piece of his daughter in the vast debris field. And shortly after, he would find Diana's body miraculously intact because tree branches had cushioned her fall from the sky. But there was no such solace for the rest of his family, because Svetlana's body was found in a cornfield and Konstantin's on an asphalt road near a bus shelter. So obviously, the physical violence of the crash had spared no one. And for Vitaly, the pain was beyond description. I can't even imagine losing your entire being in just a moment. It's absolutely heartbreaking. The man who had been an active professional and a loving father suddenly became, in his brother's words, a broken man. And in the aftermath, Kaloyev's mental state just deteriorated. He couldn't work, he could barely eat or sleep, and relatives recall finding Vitaly at the cemetery at all hours, even at 2 a.m., just weeping at the graves of his wife and children. And he withdrew from the world and locked himself away in his torment, because his entire purpose in life had been obliterated on that July night, and he was haunted by nightmares of his family's last moments. And in the investigation that followed the crash, it became clear that a series of errors by Skyguide's air traffic control had caused the tragedy. And Peter Nielsen had given the Bashkirian passenger plane an incorrect instruction to descend, putting it on a collision path, and failed to notice the planes converging until it was too late. And an automated warning system that could have averted the disaster had been temporarily shut off for maintenance. So Nielsen was left handling multiple screens alone, a situation that would later be criticized as gross negligence by his employer, Skyguide. And to Vitaly, these facts were a horrifying revelation, because his family's death wasn't just a freak accident, it was a result of human failure. And in his mind, one human bore the brunt of that responsibility, and that was Peter Nielsen. So as months passed, Vitaly's grief festered and morphed into anger. And he felt that justice was not being served. And Skyguide officials issued formal apologies to the families, but to Vitaly it felt hollow and pointless even. He wanted someone to personally say, "I'm sorry" for the loss of his wife and children. and he wanted an admission of culpability. So in the one-year memorial service in July 2003, Vitaly approached a Sky Guide representative and asked if he could meet Peter Nilsson face to face. And perhaps he needed to see the man's eyes when he asked why his children had to die. Perhaps he just sought acknowledgement of his inner pain, but he received no answer, and his request was ignored. And this dismissal was a turning point. The loss of his family had left him in a mental abyss, and now he believed that the people responsible didn't even have the decency to face him. So the feeling of being wronged and unheard began to burn within side of himself. So over the next months, Vitaly's thoughts grew darker and darker. And according to later reports, he had angry outbursts in which he referred to Nilsson as scum and even threatened Sky Guide officials in demanding accountability. And family members grew concerned as Vitaly seemed single-mindedly fixated on Nilsson. And the legal processes were moving very slowly, as they do, because Swiss prosecutors were investigating the crash, but no charges had been brought against Nilsson or Sky Guide by late 2003. So to Vitaly, it felt like nothing was being done, while the man who he believed killed his family just walked free, living comfortably with his own wife and children. So this stark contrast between Nilsson enjoying his life with his family while Vitaly visited 3 graves just became Vitaly's obsession. All right, real quick, I want to tell you about something I actually use every single day, and that's Surfshark VPN. Thank you so much to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video and supporting the channel. So, Surfshark actually just hit a huge milestone. They're now the only VPN with servers in 100 countries. That's insane coverage. But what I love most is that one subscription covers unlimited devices. I'm talking your phone, your laptop, smart TV, your roommate's tablet, literally everything at the same time. And I use it constantly when I'm traveling to access my streaming services, but also just at home to keep my data safe. And plus, their 24/7 customer support is actually helpful. Like, real humans who know what they're talking about, not a robot on the other end that you're screaming at for hours. I've been there, all right? But not with Surfshark. And here's the best part. They have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try completely risk-free. And right now, you can get 4 extra months free. F-R-E-E, free, baby. And you can do that by going to surfshark.com/callmekris. That's surfshark.com/KALLMEKRIS. And you can use code callmekris at checkout. But seriously, for like 1 coffee a month, you're protecting all of your devices and unlocking the entire internet. And the link and code are in the description as well. That's surfshark.com/callmekris and code callmekris for 4 extra months free. Thank you so much to Surfshark for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. So on February 21st, 2004, Vitaly quietly left his home in Vladikavkaz, Russia, and he told no one of his true intentions. And his destination was Peter Nilsson's home in the Swiss town of Kloten near Zurich, because Vitaly had hired a Moscow private investigator to track down where Nilsson lived with his family. And now he was on his way there, fueled by grief and anger. So he purchased a plane ticket to Switzerland and arrived in Zurich on February 22nd. And he checked into a modest hotel near the airport called the Welcome Inn, just a short distance from Nilsson's neighborhood. And hotel staff later described Vitaly as eerily quiet and unremarkable during those days. He kind of kept to himself, often staying in his room, speaking little to anyone, most likely just fixated on the actions he was about to commit. So there was nothing outwardly alarming about this middle-aged Russian man in room 316. But inside, he was counting down the hours to a confrontation. And for 2 days, he waited and watched. And the address he had for Nilsson was only a half-hour walk away from the hotel. So on the afternoon of February 24th, 2004, he decided the time had come. And Vitaly slipped a 22-centimeter folding knife into his jacket. And he left the hotel and walked through the quiet suburban streets of Kloten toward the Nilsson family home. And the neighborhood itself was very peaceful, and outside, a neighbor noticed the unfamiliar man who appeared to be searching for something, and she approached and asked if she could help. And Vitaly wordlessly showed her the piece of paper with Peter Nilsson's name, and this helpful neighbor pointed to the correct house and then watched puzzled as the stranger did not go knock on the door. Instead, Vitaly walked into the front garden and sat down, quietly waiting. It was just an eerie calm before the storm. And inside the house, Nielsen had just returned home from a weekend trip to Geneva. And it was around 6 p.m. at this point. And his wife picked him up from the airport, and now they were settling in, likely unaware of the silent figure outside. Nielsen eventually noticed the man in his yard and went out, perhaps assuming it was a confused visitor or a gardener. And his young children followed along, maybe thinking just nothing of it. Because Cloton was a safe place, it was a safe neighborhood. But his wife did call out for the children to come back, but they would stay with their father. So Nielsen walked up to the stranger and asked what he wanted. And Nielsen's wife, inside the house, suddenly heard a kind of scream. And she ran to check, and to her horror, saw her husband engaged in a struggle with this unknown man. And the Nielsen children stood there, eyes wide and just confused. And Mrs. Nielsen, desperately herself, rushed out only to witness the final moments of the attack. Vitaly had confronted Nielsen and, after a brief exchange, lunged at him with the knife. And he stabbed Nielsen repeatedly, and later reports would say that Nielsen was stabbed 17 times. So the assault was frenzied and vicious, fueled by 2 years of pent-up sorrow and absolute rage. And Nielsen had virtually no time to react or defend himself, so he was gravely wounded in seconds, collapsing in his front yard. So his wife arrived just as Kaloyev stood over her now very wounded husband. And Nielsen obviously was bleeding profusely from multiple wounds, and unfortunately he would die within minutes in front of his family. And Vitaly Kaloyev would only kill Nielsen, and he did not harm Nielsen's wife or children at all. His wrath was solely focused on the man he blamed. So with Nielsen down, Vitaly dropped the bloody knife and fled the scene on foot. And Mrs. Nielsen could only scream for help as her husband lay motionless. The police arrived at 6:17 p.m. and paramedics could do nothing. And Peter Nielsen, the 36-year-old father of 3, was already deceased. And Swiss police launched a manhunt immediately, and they had a description from witnesses. A burly, unshaven, dark-haired man in his late 40s, possibly Eastern European. And the one neighbor had seen him close up when he asked for Nielsen by name. And importantly, investigators quickly found the discarded knife in a nearby bush. But perhaps the biggest clue was something the killer left behind unintentionally. And it was his identity. So when police canvassed local hotels, they discovered that a Russian national named Vitaly Kaloyev had recently checked into the nearby Welcome Inn, and his proximity to the crime made him a prime suspect. So the next day, February 25th, Swiss police tracked down and arrested Vitaly at his hotel, and he did not resist arrest, because the grief-crazed father's quest for revenge had ended in blood, and now he was in custody. And when questioned by authorities, Kaloyev appeared to be just in a daze. And in initial interrogations and later in court, he offered no clear explanation for what he had done and even claimed not to remember the act of killing Nielsen at all. It was like he just blacked out in a fit of rage. And he said he only intended to talk to Nielsen and to receive an apology for his family. A peaceful errand, he insisted, not premeditated murder. But the fact that he brought a knife and stabbed the man repeatedly told a very different story, especially after such a short exchange. So at this point, Vitaly had taken the law, and in the most violent way possible. In his mind, Nielsen paid with his life for the lives of Konstantin, Diana, and Svetlana. The vigilante father had now exacted his revenge. But now there was another family who was without a family member, because an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. So the killing of Peter Nielsen sent shockwaves through Switzerland and made headlines around the world. Here was a man so overcome by grief that he flew to a foreign country to murder an air traffic controller. And Swiss prosecutors charged Vitaly with premeditated killing, a serious offense that in Swiss law lies between standard murder and manslaughter. And his trial took place in Zurich in late 2005. Vitaly stood gaunt and sorrowful, sat in the dock as the court heard how he methodically avenged his family. And on October 26, 2005, the verdict would come, and he was found guilty of the intentional killing of Peter Nielsen and sentenced to 8 years in prison. And the Swiss public, while sympathetic to his loss, still firmly viewed him as a murderer. Some even argued that he should have received a longer sentence. And Vitali's lawyers appealed, and in 2006, the Swiss Supreme Court slightly reduced his sentence to 5 years and 3 months, reasoning perhaps that his mental state was deeply affected by trauma. And with credit for time served, Vitali's prison term was already well underway. And in 2007, after about 3.5 years behind bars, a parole board approved Kaloyev for early release on good behavior. The prosecution then appealed the parole, and in August, the court accepted, keeping Vitali in prison. But on November 8, 2007, Vitali was paroled again and walked out of prison a free man, having served roughly 2/3 of his reduced sentence. And what happened next was something the Swiss authorities found hard to fathom. Because when Kaloyev returned home to North Ossetia in southern Russia, he was greeted not with scorn or shame, but with celebration. And at Vladikavkaz airport, a crowd of supporters gathered to welcome him. And young men from a local youth movement held up a banner in the Ossetian language that read, "You are a real man." Because to them, Kaloyev was a hero, a father who had defended his family's honor when no one else would. And many Russians felt that justice had been done. And Vitaly Yushko, a representative of a Russian group from air crash victims' families, openly stated that Kaloyev is a hero because in too many cases, those responsible for tragedies remain unpunished, and such radical vengeance was the only way to make them take responsibility. And the sentiment was widely shared in Russia, and polls and public commentary at the time showed significant sympathy for Vitali's act, viewing it as a heroic deed of retaliation. And the hero's welcome deeply disturbed people in Switzerland and elsewhere in Western media. And they expressed dismay that a man convicted of killing an innocent person, for in the eyes of the law, Nielsen had not been criminally guilty of anything yet, was being glorified. And it just sparked a giant debate. Was Kaloyev a vengeful killer or a grief-stricken avenger? Or could someone be both? And the contrast in perception was stark. In Russia, with its history of war and cultural emphasis on honor and collective trauma, Kaloyev's vendetta resonated emotionally. But in Switzerland, a nation of laws and order, his act was seen as a dangerous affront to the justice system. And for his part, Vitaly Kaloyev never expressed remorse for what he did. And he publicly stated that he did not regret confronting Nielsen. And in one interview, he said, quote, "I don't really take offense at people who call me a murderer. People who say that would betray their own children, their own motherland. I protected the honor of my children and the memory of my children," unquote. So to Vitaly, anyone who wouldn't seek such revenge in his situation lacked love for their family. And he even coldly remarked about Nielsen, quote, "He's nobody to me. He was an idiot, and that's why he paid for it with his life," unquote. Vitaly claimed that if Nielsen had simply invited him into his home that day and shown some empathy, quote, "the conversation would have happened in softer tones, and the tragedy might not have happened," unquote. So in his mind, Nielsen's refusal to speak with him sealed his fate. And after his return, Vitaly's life took an upward turn, at least on the surface. And the regional government of North Ossetia named him to become the Deputy Minister of Construction in 2008, effectively giving him back a respected role in society. And in 2016, upon his retirement, Vitaly was awarded the highest regional honor, the Medal, quote, "to the glory of Ossetia," unquote, praising his contributions to the community and perhaps by extension acknowledging his status as a local folk hero. And the medal commendation spoke of improving living conditions and maintaining law and order, an official gloss that avoided mentioning the grim source of Kaloyev's fame. And in the years following his revenge, Vitaly slowly rebuilt a semblance of a personal life as well. And around 2012, he would marry Irina Zarazova, who was an engineer from his region. And in a bittersweet twist of fate, Vitaly became a father again in his late 60s. And in December 2008, Irina gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. And it's as if his life granted Vitaly another chance at family. Though he reportedly kept a shrine for Konstantin and Diana in his home, including Diana's crib preserved with her toys, never forgetting the family he lost. So I was doom scrolling at 2 a.m. the other night, as you do. Couldn't sleep. yet again, and realized how much my back was hurting. So, naturally, I diagnosed myself with the tumor via the internet instead of just, going to see an actual doctor. Sound familiar? Well, turns out I don't have a tumor, thank God. Because with the help of ZocDoc, I found a real doctor in real life really, really fast. And listen, sometimes booking an appointment, especially a doctor's appointment, feels like a part-time job. And that's why I started using ZocDoc. It's a free app and a website where you can search and compare high-quality in-network doctors and click to instantly book an appointment. We're talking over 100,000 doctors across every specialty: dental, mental health, primary care, urgent care, you name it. And you can filter for doctors who take your insurance, which is awesome, and that are nearby and fit your specific needs, and are highly rated by verified patients. I'm one of them. And you can also see their actual appointment openings and pick the time and book it. Done. And most appointments happen within 24 to 72 hours, and sometimes even the same day. I've been able to book same-day appointments on multiple occasions, which is super handy. So I was actually able to get my back checked out, and turns out I just have terrible posture. Look at that posture. What the hell am I doing right now? What is that? Anyway, stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/CCCM to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/CCCM. ZocDoc.com/CCCM. Thank you so much to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. Today, more than 20 years later, people remain divided about Vitaly Kallmekris. In North Ossetia, many still view him with respect and understanding, a man who did what a father had to do, but in Switzerland, his name is a reminder of a terrifying incident of vigilantism. And for the families of the other air crash victims, the Kallmekris case stirs mixed feelings. Some empathize with his anger, while others, like another Russian father who lost his entire family in the same crash, openly deplored the killing and said it dishonored the memory of the victims. And in my opinion, and we can have a discussion down in the comments below, I am of the thought that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, and in this case specifically, it being a horrible accident, and I can't even imagine the way Nielsen felt after having been the hand of helping kill 71 people. Yes, he got to live on in his life, but what kind of life is that? I don't know. I don't think getting revenge for that is going to bring anybody back. And obviously murder is wrong and illegal, so obviously I don't agree with that. But there are some cases where it's like an intentional killing of an innocent person, and I would turn the other cheek. It's just all horrible. It's a horrible story. We have a man that lost his entire family in a second, and then we have another family who lost a father and a husband, and these kids will grow up with no father now. And is that good? Is that right? I don't think so. But let me know what you guys think down below. Obviously, we all know murder is wrong, but we can talk in hypotheticals down in the comments. But with that, let's move on to the next story. Marianne Buckmeyer was an ordinary woman who was dealt a very difficult hand in life long before she became infamous. She was born on June 3rd, 1950, in a small town in West Germany. And Marianne's childhood was troubled. She grew up in a very strict conservative household with parents who were, by her account, very harsh and unloving. Her father had been a soldier in World War II, a member of the Waffen-SS, a combat branch of the Nazis' paramilitary, which brings a whole new meaning to my dad's being a Nazi. He literally was a Nazi. I can't even imagine. And he was obviously an authoritarian figure at home, often drinking heavily and growing aggressive. And her parents' marriage fell apart at one point, and Marianne clashed with her mother and stepfather to the point where she was kicked out of the house as a teenager. So by the age of 16, Marianne was essentially on her own, and the turbulent upbringing led her into a rebellious youth. So as a teenager, Marianne sought love and stability that she never felt at home, and she would become pregnant at just 16 years old with her first child. So overwhelmed and barely more than a child herself, she made the painful decision to give up that baby for adoption. And 2 years later, at 18, she became pregnant again by her boyfriend. But tragedy would strike during that pregnancy, and Marianne would be raped shortly before giving birth. And for those of you listening on YouTube, I need to heavily censor things, but she got taken advantage of by a man. I just want to make sure you have that context. So traumatized and struggling, she also gave up the second baby for adoption as an infant. By the age of 20, Marianne had already endured more heartbreak than many do in an entire lifetime. So these experiences just hardened her in some ways, but they also fueled an intense protective instinct over the one child she would eventually keep. So in 1972, at 22 years old, Marianne had a third child, a daughter named Anna. And the father was a man who managed a pub where Marianne worked. And this time, Marianne decided to raise the child herself, determined to be a mother despite her challenging circumstances. So she and baby Anna settled into the city of Lübeck in northern West Germany. And Marianne was a single mother, trying to make ends meet by running her own small pub in town. So it was a bohemian, somewhat wild life, and Marianne often worked late into the night serving drinks and sleeping during the day. And by all accounts, she wasn't a conventional cookie-cutter mom, and she often brought little Anna to the pub with her during her shifts or let the child sleep in the back room while she finished serving customers, and allegedly partied. And friends noted that Marianne treated Anna more like a grown-up than a child, expecting her to be independent from a very young age. And the truth is, Marianne struggled to balance motherhood with her personal life. She loved her daughter deeply, but she was also frank about her difficulties. And at one point, she even considered putting Anna up for adoption, thinking another family might provide a more stable life for this girl. But despite the unconventional upbringing, those who knew them say Anna was a happy, bright little girl. And Anna was Marianne's whole world. So by 1980, Anna was 7 years old, and Marianne was now 30 and had matured through hardship and was doing her best to raise Anna right. But life as a single mom and a pub owner was never easy. Money was tight, and Marianne's personal life was messy at times. But the mother and daughter had an unbreakable bond, and they definitely had weathered life's storms together. And tragically, the greatest storm was yet to come, one that would destroy the life they had built. So May 5th, 1980 began like any other day, but it would end as the darkest day of Marianne's life. Because that morning, Marianne and Anna had a typical mother-daughter fight, and upset, Anna decided to skip school that day instead of attending classes. But Anna just wanted to teach her mom a lesson by not going to school after their argument. But at some point during that day, Anna encountered a neighbor named Klaus Grabowski. Grabowski was a local butcher by trade and was 35 years old, and he lived not far from the Bachmeier home. And he wasn't a stranger, because allegedly Anna had been to his house before, specifically to play with his cats, as kids in neighborhoods sometimes do. But Grabowski was far from a harmless neighbor, and he had a history of offenses against children and had previously been convicted for child molestation. But to a trusting child like Anna, he might have just seemed like a man with friendly pets. That afternoon, Grabowski somehow lured Anna into his house. And some accounts suggest he offered to show her the cats again or give her something, but the exact pretext remains uncertain. But what is tragically certain is that once he had Anna inside, he did the unthinkable, and he would hold Anna captive for several hours in his home. And during this time, it is believed that he her, although the precise details were never fully confirmed. And Grabowski himself would actually later deny doing this to her, but given his past and the entire situation, is strongly inferred. Finally, at some point on May 5th, Grabowski would murder Anna, and Anna would die by asphyxiation, and the murder weapon being his own fiance's pantyhose. Just a deplorable level of evil. He is a monster. A waste of oxygen, as I always say. Just horrifying. And as if his acts weren't heinous enough, Grabowski then tried to hide what he'd done. And he would put Anna's body into a cardboard box. And he would leave that box on the bank of a nearby canal. So he discarded her like trash, hoping her body wouldn't be found or identified quickly. But he did not get away with it for very long. His own fiancée had turned him in to the authorities that very evening, and it's reported that she had noticed something horribly amiss. Perhaps she saw Anna's school bag or sensed a disturbance, and upon questioning, Grabowski confessed to her. And some other accounts say that he simply confessed to her upon her return home, but regardless of how she found out, she immediately alerted the police, ensuring that Grabowski was arrested that same night and that Anna's body was quickly found and recovered. So thank goodness for that fiancé. And we can only imagine how Marianne felt after hearing about what this monster did to her little girl. And under interrogation, Grabowski admitted to killing Anna, but denied essaying her, as I said before. And instead, he concocted a story that stunned both police and the public. And Grabowski claimed that Anna tried to seduce him and blackmail him. She's a child, by the way. So according to his account, this 7-year-old child supposedly said she would tell her mother he S her unless he gave her money. A 7-year-old child. And that he strangled her out of panic that he'd go back to prison. So you murdered a child because you didn't want to go back to prison? Because a child was blackmailing you? I swear to God, I don't know. So this grotesque lie blaming the victim for her own death would later become a central point of outrage for Marianne, completely understandably, because the sheer insult of that claim would burn in her mind every day until the trial. And as the police prepared charges, more of Grabowski's background came to light. And he had reportedly undergone a form of castration voluntarily, hoping to reduce his urges, but apparently it failed or he just stopped treatment. And this was an option given to certain offenders as a way for them to be allowed freely back into society, which I don't understand. Put them in a hole in the ground, all right? That's my opinion. But keep it open so they can just live on with their days and just look up at the sky and wish they were dead. Is that too much? I don't think it's too much. And then he later tricked a doctor into providing hormone treatments to help his libido return. So the point of the castration was what exactly? And his defense team would later argue that these hormone treatments caused a hormonal imbalance that influenced his actions. He's a adult, who cares? But to Marianne and to the German public and just anyone who ever heard this case, it was clear. Grabowski was a predator who had slipped through the cracks of the system only to kill an innocent child. And in the aftermath of Anna's murder, Marianne was inconsolable because she had lost the one constant love of her life. And to make it worse, one can only imagine she had moments of terrible guilt, and that morning argument tormented her. If only she hadn't argued with Anna, maybe her daughter wouldn't have skipped school, wouldn't have crossed paths with this monster. I can't even imagine all the what-ifs that were going through that poor mother's mind. So Marianne was racked with grief and anger in the months leading up to the trial, and she followed the case closely as prosecutors prepared to charge Grabowski with murder. But as the legal process ground forward, Marianne grew increasingly frustrated, and she felt that Grabowski, through his lawyer, was trying to paint her daughter as somehow complicit in this sick way. And additionally, Marianne likely feared that even if justice was served in court, it wouldn't be enough. And West German law at the time did allow life imprisonment for murder, but actual time served could be much shorter, as we saw in the last case. Although not in Germany, it's never guaranteed. And there was the haunting possibility that a savvy defense might get Grabowski a lesser sentence due to diminished responsibility, for instance, blaming the hormone therapy, which is insane. So the justice system, to Marianne, felt like it was moving too slowly and too leniently for the man who had shattered her entire world. And every day, she had to endure the fact that Grabowski was alive, sitting in jail, and had the audacity to spin lies about a child, her child, Anna. So the simmering anger in her was reaching a boiling point. And she later said, quote, "I heard he wanted to make a statement. I thought, Now comes the next lie about this victim who was my child, unquote. Marianne's patience with the legal process was almost gone. And by early 1981, the stage was set for a trial in Lubbock District Court. And everyone had an opinion on the tragic murder of little Anna and what should be done with Grabowski. And Marianne Bachmeier, the bereaved mother, started to become a familiar figure, but nothing close to what she was soon about to become. So the third day of Grabowski's trial, March 6, 1981, started off routinely in the Lubbock courthouse. And proceedings were underway in room 157 of the district court. And Grabowski sat in the defendant's area facing justice for the murder of Anna. And he was likely in handcuffs, flanked by guards, with his defense attorneys present. And in the gallery of the courtroom sat journalists, curious members of the public, and among them, Marianne. Because the 31-year-old mother had come to every day of the trial carrying the unbearable weight of hearing clinical details about her daughter's death and the defense's infuriating arguments. But on this day, she was there with a deadly purpose. And unknown to court security, Marianne managed to smuggle a pistol into the courtroom inside her handbag. And it was a small Beretta 70 semi-automatic, a .22 caliber weapon. And how she slipped it past the guards is still unconfirmed. Though it's likely that in 1981, German court security was not as strict as today, and handbags were thoroughly checked. But regardless, Marianne sat in the courtroom gallery that morning, her purse clutched tightly to her body. And those around her noticed she was quiet and stone-faced, but they assumed it was just her grief. And the session went on until mid-morning when the judge called for a short recess in the proceedings. And this was the moment Marianne had been waiting for. So as the room stirred with people standing up to stretch, she calmly stood as well. Then, with determined resolve, Marianne reached into her purse and drew out the pistol. Before anyone could react, she stepped into the aisle and moved towards the front of the courtroom. And she now stood directly behind the defendant's bench, where Grabowski was seated with his back turned, completely unsuspecting. And in an instant, Marianne raised the gun, pointed it at his back, and began firing relentlessly. And the sharp cracks of gunfire echoed in the courtroom. She emptied the Beretta's magazine, firing 7 or 8 shots in total. Reports differ on this, but emptying the magazine nonetheless. And chaos just erupted, and onlookers gasped and ducked for cover. And Grabowski was hit by several bullets, and later reports said 6 shots struck him, all in his back and side. And Grabowski lurched forward from the impacts and collapsed on the floor, mortally wounded. He had no chance to even cry out or confront her, and his death came quickly. And people were screaming, and lawyers and spectators hid under tables and ran for the exits, terrified by the sudden eruption of violence in what was supposed to be a place of law and order. And the judge and court officials were in shock, just like everyone else, and gun smoke hung in the air of the courtroom. And in the midst of the chaos stood Marianne, the gun in her hand. And as guards finally reacted and rushed towards her, Marianne lowered her pistol. She did not attempt to flee, nor did she resist arrest. In fact, she stood calm and motionless, the rage that propelled her seemingly spent. And 2 police officers cautiously approached and took the weapon from her hand, and she surrendered without a fight, her eyes likely still on Grabowski's lifeless body. And in those first moments after the shooting, several witnesses heard Marianne speak, and according to some accounts, she said, quote, "I wanted to kill him," unquote. As officers led her away, she supposedly added, quote, "He killed my daughter. I wanted to shoot him in the face, but I shot him in the back. I hope he's dead," unquote. Murder is very, very wrong. Murdering a child is extra wrong. And that's all I'm going to say on that. But anyway, some claimed they even heard her call Grabowski a pig under her breath. No notes from me. So these statements removed any ambiguity about Marianne's intent. And Grabowski, bleeding on the courtroom floor, was indeed dead, or nearly so, and medics could not save him. And in a macabre turn, the trials for Anna's murder abruptly ended, and the defendant was now Marianne herself. And she had killed a man in front of dozens of witnesses in a court of law. Very bad. Do not recommend. That is against the law. Yet, as news of what happened spread through Germany, a wave of public sympathy flooded toward Marianne. understandable. To many, she was no murderer. She was a mother who did what the system could not. The media quickly dubbed her the Revenge Mother, and her act ignited a national conversation about vigilante justice. But for the moment, however, Marianne was placed under arrest and led away from the scene of her vengeance, likely still in shock from what she had done. The courtroom shooting of Klaus Grabowski on March 6, 1981, remains one of the most dramatic instances of vigilante action in modern history. Because it's not often that a victim's family member commits an outright execution in the middle of a trial. And that image of Marianne stepping forward with a gun and delivering her own verdict seared itself into Germany's collective memory. So after the metaphorical and actual smoke cleared in the Lübeck courtroom, Marianne was no longer just a grieving mother. She was now a defendant charged with homicide, and her arrest made headlines around the world. And many couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction at what she had done, even as others recoiled at the idea of vigilante killing in a courtroom. I think it's just natural human instinct to want a bad person not to be here anymore, and the idea of a mother taking justice into her own hands, that's, it's like metal, but also very wrong, and there's a reason why that's illegal, because the world would be a really fucked up place if we were allowed to do that. So, it's human nature, but it's also still bad, So, that's all I'm going to say about that. You say whatever you want in the comments, okay? I'm the one making the video. That's what I'm going to say about it, all right? But the West Germany media quickly descended on the story, obviously, and Marianne's face was on every news broadcast and newspaper, and her legal consequences unfolded over the next year and a half. And Marianne had immense public support, and donations poured in for her legal defense, and in a savvy move, she decided to sell her exclusive story rights to the prominent German magazine Stern. And the magazine reportedly paid her around $158,000, which is a very large sum, especially in the 80s, for her personal story, money which she used to cover her attorney fees. And Stern then ran a series of articles that not only recounted Marianne's life and actions, but also painted a sympathetic portrait of her as a hardworking single mother pushed to the brink. And the public ate it up, and letters to the editor came in by the thousands, many expressing understanding or outright support for Marianne's act. And on November 2nd, 1982, Marianne was charged in court with murder, and her own trial began. And it was a media circus. TV crews from around the world showed up to cover the case, public opinion was sharply divided, and this was reflected in the courtroom arguments. And the prosecution argued that this was a premeditated, cold-blooded killing, which technically it was, yes. And they pointed out that Marianne had carefully planned the shooting, even allegedly purchasing the gun well beforehand. And a friend later testified that Marianne had conducted target practice in the cellar of her pub in the weeks after Anna's death, rehearsing for what she intended to do. Some girl's girl, like with a suggested calculation and not just a momentary snap of insanity. And Marianne's defense, however, aimed to reduce her culpability, and they portrayed her mental state as one of temporary insanity or irresistible impulse driven by traumatic grief, which also, I agree. I think it could be both. She might have wanted to, and then she might have just had the gun, which is illegal. She wasn't supposed to bring that in. So, I think, again, human nature, we want to give her the benefit of the doubt, but technically, she killed someone. And during her testimony, Marianne claimed that she had dreamt of shooting Grabowski, and that on the day of the act, she felt like she was in a trance or dreamlike state. Completely understandable. And a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation was done to assess her sanity. And at one point during the investigation, Marianne was asked to provide a handwriting sample. And in a dissociative moment, she wrote, "I did it for you, Anna," on the paper, and then surrounded the words with 7 little hearts, so it's believed that she did one for each year of her daughter's life. It's a heartbreaking story. And this was presented as evidence of her profound emotional disturbance and singular motive of avenging her child. So the trial lasted 28 days, drawing intense coverage. And crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, and inside, debates raged on legal and ethical questions. Was this murder or manslaughter provoked by extreme circumstances? Should a grieving mother be treated with leniency, or would that signal that vigilante killings are acceptable? It is a extremely tough case. The case pitted the cold letter of the law against the warm-blooded passions of the public. And in the end, the court found a middle ground. And on March 2nd, 1983, the judges announced their verdict. Marianne was convicted of manslaughter instead of murder, and they concluded that while she had planned the act, so it was premeditated to an extent, her mental state was not entirely in cold blood, kind of what I was saying. There was definitely a middle ground. And she was also found guilty of unlawful possession of a firearm, obviously. She brought a gun into a courtroom. But Marianne was sentenced to 6 years in prison for the shooting. And the sentence was seen as relatively lenient given the murder could have meant life imprisonment. But even this punishment was too harsh in the eyes of many supporters. And a survey by the Allensbach Institute at the time revealed how conflicted the public was, because 28% of Germans felt 6 years was an appropriate sentence, and 27% thought it was way too heavy, and 25% thought it was too light. So this is quite evenly split everywhere. These split opinions reflected the nation's divide. Some still revered her as a righteous avenger, and others believed in upholding the rule of law. But in the end, Marianne did not even serve those full 6 years, and she was given credit for time in custody during trial, and due to good behavior, she became eligible for early release. And in June of 1985, after serving only 3 years of her 6-year sentence, Marianne was released from prison and on probation. And she was 35 years old and free, yet her life in Germany was effectively over, because the notoriety and just the intense memories made it impossible to quietly resume a normal life there. So after her release, Marianne sought to escape the media glare and the ghosts of Lübeck, so she decided to move abroad. And in the late 1980s, she actually went to Nigeria in Africa, of all places, and got married there. And little is known about her husband or that chapter in her life, but it appears she tried to find peace far away from the scene of her pain. And though the marriage didn't last forever, eventually Marianne divorced and moved on, and by the early 1990s, she had relocated to Sicily, Italy, and one imagines her perhaps living in a quiet coastal town or a rural village, trying to live anonymously under the Mediterranean sun, carrying her heavy memories privately. But fate had one more cruel twist for Marianne. And in the mid-1990s, she was actually diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, an aggressive and usually terminal illness. So knowing she didn't have much time left, Marianne decided to return to Germany for her final days. And she went back to Lübeck, the very place where her life had been shattered. And most likely because she wanted to be near her beloved daughter's resting place. And in 1996, as her condition worsened, she asked Lucas Maria Boehmer, a reporter from NDR, North German Broadcasting, to document her last weeks. And it was as if she wanted to have the final word on her story in her own way. And on September 17th, Marianne died from her cancer at the age of only 46. And in accordance with her wishes, she was laid to rest in the same cemetery as her daughter, Anna. In fact, she was buried right next to Anna's grave so that mother and daughter could symbolically be together again forever. Marianne's story did not die with her either, because in Germany, it remains a potent tale in discussions about vigilantism and victims' rights. And the case is often cited in law classes and ethics debates. And 40 years on, people still talk about, was Marianne justified? And many still feel a gut-level empathy for her. I know I do. And in 2021, a German news outlet, NDR, referred to her case as the most spectacular case of vigilante justice in German post-war history. It's a case that challenges simple judgment. And on one hand, a man was killed in cold blood, but on the other hand, that man was a proven child murderer, and his killer was the child's grief-stricken mother. So culturally, Marianne became something of a folk figure, and books, documentaries, and films portrayed her story, including the 1996 film The Slow Death of Marianne Bachmeier by the aforementioned Lucas Maria Boehmer. And even a play titled This Is For You, Anna debuted in 1984. So Marianne Bachmeier's name became a symbol, a caution, and a legend of what can happen when grief and anger collide in a person's soul, and the legal system is perceived as inadequate. And that brings us to our last story. Eduardo Gallo was a man who, on the surface, had a successful and comfortable life. Living in Mexico City, Eduardo was a prosperous management consultant, and he was well educated and came from a respectable family background. By the late 1990s, Eduardo was in his 50s and had built a good reputation in his community as a smart and determined individual. But what truly defined Eduardo was his role as a father, because his daughter, Paula Gallo, was the apple of his eye. She was born around 1975, and by the year 2000, she was 25 years old. And she was, by all accounts, an extraordinary young woman. She was dark-haired, full of life and kind-hearted, with a passion for helping others and singing. And Paola was in her third year of graduate studies pursuing a master's degree in psychoanalysis, and she often volunteered at orphanages in her spare time, just a saint of a woman. And her friends described her as always being surrounded by people, bringing joy wherever she went. And Eduardo was immensely proud of Paula, and as her father, he devoted himself to giving her a good life and education. By all accounts, the father-daughter bond was incredibly strong, and Eduardo's work allowed them certain luxuries, including a cherished weekend home in Tepoztlan, a picturesque town about 35 miles south of Mexico City. And Tepoztlan is known for its scenic beauty and was a popular getaway for well-to-do families from the capital. It was a place of cobblestone streets, lush hills, and a sense of tranquility. And for Eduardo and Paula, the weekend home was a retreat from the hustle of the city life, a spot to relax and spend some quality time together and with friends. So in July of 2000, Paula was just finishing her studies, and the future was looking very, very bright. And Eduardo might have been contemplating a slower pace of life soon, maybe even looking forward to walking Paula down the aisle one day if she married, or playing with future grandchildren. They were just ordinary, happy people with plans and dreams. And before tragedy struck, Eduardo's character was one of integrity and determination, but those traits would be put to the ultimate test. So the nightmare would begin early July 2000. So Paula and a group of her friends had gone to that family's weekend house for a little getaway. And it was supposed to be a relaxing time. The group of friends lounged around the property, enjoying music and conversation in the warm night air, feeling perfectly safe within the walled confines of the Gallo vacation home. But suddenly, their peace was shattered. And as dusk settled, a group of armed men jumped over the fence of the property and burst into the house. And the intruders terrorized Paula and her friends for 2 full hours. They brandished guns, barking orders and threats. And the friends were likely tied up or held at gunpoint, utterly helpless. And the kidnappers ransacked the house, grabbing jewelry, clothing, and any valuables they could find. But theft was not their main goal, because by the end of that ordeal, the armed men dragged Paula away, forcing her into the 2 cars they also stole from the property to use as getaway vehicles. And in a span of hours, Eduardo Gallo's cherished daughter had gone from enjoying a weekend with friends to being a kidnap victim thrust into the clutches of criminals. And the armed gang vanished into the night with Paula, leaving behind traumatized witnesses and a scene of chaos. And for the kidnappers in Mexico, the next step was routine, a ransom demand. And sure enough, not long after, Eduardo was contacted by the kidnappers, and they demanded money in exchange for Paula's safe return. And it's hard to even imagine how Eduardo was feeling in this moment, just absolute dread and panic and just focused on getting his daughter back. And kidnapping was, and unfortunately still is, a notorious criminal enterprise in Mexico, often motivated by money. So Eduardo would have known that the sooner he paid, the sooner Paula might be released. And the longer things dragged on, the greater the danger to her. So the ransom was set at $18,500 USD in cash, plus some expensive jewelry. And Eduardo scrambled to put this together. And although relatively well off, he didn't have unlimited resources. But he liquidated what he could quickly, because time was of the essence. And he managed to gather the sum the kidnappers asked for, just demonstrating a parent's willingness to sacrifice everything for their child. So a meeting was arranged to exchange money for Paula. And the details of the drop were likely dictated by the kidnappers, so a remote location, a certain time of night, and Eduardo followed their instructions to the letter, desperate not to provoke them to harm Paula. And on the appointed night, the ransom was delivered to a spot outside of the city. And what happened next is somewhat shrouded in confusion and controversy. And a violent confrontation broke out at the ransom drop point. And gunfire erupted from some unknown party, and when the shooting stopped, 3 of the kidnappers lay dead. and the ransom exchange had turned into a bloodbath. And the kidnappers, paranoid and on edge, believed that they had been ambushed by law enforcement. But in reality, it's unclear who fired on them. But in any case, the result was devastating. The surviving kidnappers, thinking Eduardo set them up, took revenge on Paula, and they would murder her. And for an agonizing week after the kidnapping, Eduardo clung to hope that paying the ransom would bring Paula home. But then, Paula's body was found, and she had been shot twice, once in the neck and once in the back. Just a cruel execution. And her body was discovered not far from the location where the bodies of the 3 dead kidnappers had been found a few days earlier. And so it seemed the gang, enraged by the deaths of their comrades, had taken Paula's life in retaliation and dumped her like trash. And when the news reached Eduardo, his world collapsed. Because despite doing everything asked of him, the system had failed utterly to protect his child. In fact, it seemed the system's incompetence might have directly led to her death. And Morelos state officials leaked stories to the media that implied Eduardo himself had arranged an armed rescue that caused the bloodbath, suggesting that the blame might lie with him. But this was completely untrue, because a father like Eduardo would never risk his child's life in that way. And it only added insult to injury. And Eduardo suspected instead it was the police who might have secretly tried to intercept the kidnappers, resulting in the shootout that killed some and sealed Paula's fate. And his suspicions gained credence when roughly 2/3 of the ransom money was later found near the bodies of the dead kidnappers and returned to him, but the rest had vanished. So if an outside group killed those kidnappers and took some money, it pointed toward either a rogue police operation or criminal competitors. So here was Eduardo Gallo, a father who had lost his only daughter in the most horrific way, and grief overwhelmed him, but also something else, anger and a drive for answers. Because he wanted to know exactly who killed his Paula and to see them held accountable. And initially, he put his faith into the authorities to solve the case. And police did catch a few suspects early on. 3 men were quickly arrested right after Paula's death and were awaiting trial, but these were likely lower-level accomplices or people tied to the dead kidnappers. And the actual gunman who had actually pulled the trigger on Paula was not among them. That man had fled and remained at large. And weeks turned into months, and the official investigation stalled. And Eduardo just grew increasingly frustrated, and it soon became apparent that the Morelos State Police investigation was a mess, to say the least. Just riddled with errors and apparent corruption, as he later described. And he started discovering shocking lapses. For instance, when one of the cars stolen during the kidnapping recovered a few months later, the police refused to perform forensic tests on it. And one officer absurdly said it was because it was raining. Water doesn't just wash stuff away. Who are these people? So Eduardo had to push the issue up the chain of command to get the car examined. And when they finally did, they found strands of Paula's hair inside, confirming it was used to transport her. But why hadn't they done it immediately? And it just got worse, because Paula's clothing from the day of the kidnapping disappeared while in police custody, meaning crucial evidence was lost. And no fingerprints were taken at the crime scene in the house after the kidnapping, and in a damning twist, Eduardo himself, by pure chance, found items stolen from his home sitting in a police storeroom, never returned and possibly being stolen by the officers. So these revelations led Eduardo to believe what many suspect, and that is that some of the police were either corrupt or grossly negligent, both extremely bad. And maybe they were colluding with kidnappers, which wasn't unheard of, especially in Mexico at this point, or they just didn't care enough to do their jobs right. Again, both terrible. And Eduardo's grief was compounded by outrage, understandably. It was as if the system was letting Paula be murdered twice, once by the kidnappers and again by burying the truth of what happened. And in an emotional letter he published in the newspaper, he laminated, quote, "What a shame that it had to be me, a neophyte in criminal investigation, who had to carry out the investigation, and that the State Attorney General's Office of Morelos limited itself to evaluating and checking the validity of my discoveries," unquote. This was a public slap to the authorities. It was a mic drop moment for Eduardo. because Eduardo was saying, I'm doing your job for you, and you suck at your job. And he tried the official channels first. He filed complaints. He met with the police chiefs. He wrote that open letter in the press describing his odyssey and even eulogizing Paula in the same breath. And he wrote to his daughter, quote, "Thank you for your smile. You always lighted the path so I could distinguish between justice and vengeance, keeping my hands clean and my soul calm, the only way I can see you again," unquote. Just rip my heart out, my lord. And these words show that Eduardo, at least at the moment, was striving to remain on the side of justice, not slip into pure revenge. He wanted to do things the right way if possible. And for a year after Paula's death, Eduardo hovered in this agonizing limbo. He would go every day to his daughter's grave, promising her silently that he wouldn't rest until he found her killer. And meanwhile, he hammered on the doors of bureaucracy for action, and eventually a stroke of luck came. And in October of 2000, Morelos State elected a new governor from an opposition party, ending 71 years of one-party rule, which is insane. So this shakeup led to new leadership in law enforcement, and the new state police chief, Jose Montiel, took a personal interest in Gallo's case, and he noted that kidnappings in Morelos were rampant and often mishandled. And in one notorious scandal, the former anti-kidnapping unit chief had himself been arrested for kidnapping and murder. What is happening in Mexico? Are you guys okay? Is anybody from Mexico? Are you okay? So Montiel understood the rot that needed cutting out. So with Montiel's support, Eduardo suddenly found police more receptive. They began to work with him as a partner rather than an annoyance. But truth be told, Eduardo was already doing the heavy lifting. So by this time, Eduardo Gallo had effectively transformed himself into a private detective. And his career and his personal life were on hold. And every morning he woke up with one mission: find the man who killed Paula. And his days were spent chasing leads, analyzing phone records, interviewing locals, and tasks typically done by detectives. And he even ventured into potential dangerous slums and villages where few city elites would dare to go. And it's said that Eduardo actually disguised himself as a traveling second-hand clothes salesman so he could move around these areas without arousing suspicion. And he painstakingly pieced together a network of criminals involved. And he knew from police that some suspects were still out there. And notably, Francisco El Gato Zamora Arellano. And he was believed to be the trigger man, and a couple of others in the gang. So Eduardo combed through cellular phone records tied to the case, mapping out who contacted whom around the time of the kidnapping, and this led him step by step to identifying the likely hideouts. And the breakthrough came when Eduardo noticed a pattern in the phone data, because one of the kidnappers had been regularly using a public payphone in a small town of Tultitlan, in the neighboring state of Mexico, just north of Mexico City. And this payphone was a lifeline. So the kidnapper used it to call other gang members, likely to avoid tracking on his own phone. And after some legwork, Eduardo found that very payphone. With this guy, it's like a movie. He's like Liam Neeson from Taken. And he deduced that if he watched it, the culprit might return to use it again. Like, he was doing the leg, arm, head, body work for this entire case. So armed with this crucial find, Eduardo coordinated with Morelos police and also roped in authorities from the state of Mexico. So on Sunday in June of 2001, nearly a year after Paula's death, they set a trap. And Eduardo himself took position as one of the lookouts near the payphone, along with plainclothes officers staked out in the surrounding building. So they waited, tense and hopeful, and their patience paid off. And a man approached the payphone and began dialing. So the watchers signaled each other. And in a coordinated move, police units swarmed in and surrounded the suspect. And he was taken down before he could flee and draw a weapon. And they had caught 28-year-old Francisco Zamora Arellano, who indeed the gang member Eduardo had been hunting. And Arellano was from a poor rural part of Guerrero State, and he had been hiding out, perhaps thinking the heat had died down at this point. So in custody, confronted with evidence, and perhaps seeing no escape, he confessed the very next day to being the one who shot and killed Paula Gallo. And this confession was a huge victory for Eduardo. He had literally hunted down his daughter's murderer through sheer will and investigative grit. But Eduardo didn't stop there, and with Arellano's capture, the rest of the kidnapping ring unraveled. And police, with Eduardo's intel, arrested several other accomplices, individuals named Anselmo Hernandez Benitez and Antonio Barragan Carrasco, and Fania Tovar Garcia and Maria Luisa Zamora Arellano. And they were charged with crimes ranging from kidnapping and aggravated murder to robbery and criminal association. So it was a broad sweep that effectively dismantled the group responsible for Paula's tragedy. And eventually, Francisco Zamora Arellano and his co-conspirators were convicted in court, and they received hefty sentences, 40 years in prison for Francisco and the others, according to reports. So at long last, the people who had destroyed Eduardo's family were behind bars. And it was largely thanks to Eduardo Gallo's refusal to give up or trust the system to work without him. And the Morelos police chief, Montiel, openly credited Eduardo, saying, quote, "This man, with much bravery, put aside all his own business and carried out the investigation," unquote. Shout out to the new police chief, man. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. And Eduardo, my goodness. So the authorities admitted that without Eduardo, the case might never have been solved. And for Eduardo, this outcome was bittersweet. He had achieved justice in the sense that Paula's killers were punished, but the personal cost was immense. He had lost his daughter, the light of his life, and he had spent a year in constant danger because at any time those he was pursuing could have targeted him for retaliation, and he had sacrificed his career and perhaps even his health. Stress likely took an immense toll on him in the process. Yet when asked about it, Eduardo expressed no regret for stepping up. If anything, he became somewhat of a folk hero among crime victims in Mexico, demonstrating that persistence can overcome even a corrupt system. So the tragedy of Paulo's murder transformed Eduardo forever, and it ignited within him a new purpose beyond just this case. And it's also important to note that Eduardo's form of vigilante justice was different from Vitaly and Marianne because he did not kill anyone with his own hands. Instead, he took the law into his own hands by performing the work of the law enforcement, albeit ending with criminals being legally arrested and tried. So Eduardo's revenge was ensuring the killers were caught and made to face justice, rather than personally executing them. And in doing so, he walked a fine line. He cooperated with police, stayed within some bounds of the law, even as he operated independently. So his story is a unique vigilante tale where the vigilante sought not blood, but truth and accountability, and he had the ability to do so. You know, these cases are all just absolutely heartbreaking, and, you know, you can understand to a certain degree why they did what they did. But I just thought I'd end it on this case where just this saint of a man lost his saint of a daughter, and he took justice into his own hands, and he was able to bring these horrible monsters to justice. It's a heartbreaking but beautiful story all the same. And in the immediate aftermath of capturing his daughter's killers, Eduardo's story became a beacon of hope and a lightning rod for debate in Mexico, because the public learned of how this grieving father tenaciously tracked down criminals when the authorities failed. And many people saw Eduardo as a heroic figure, an ordinary man who overcame a broken system to get justice. And the Morelos police chief, Montiel, held up the case as an important example for other victims, demonstrating that perseverance can crack even the toughest cases. And in a country plagued by kidnappings and often inept or corrupt police responses, Eduardo's success was inspiring. And in Mexico, victim advocacy and anti-crime movements were gaining momentum in the early 2000s, and Eduardo quickly became a prominent voice among them. And he actually became the president of a civic organization called Mexico United Against Crime, a non-governmental group focused on combating crime and pushing for public security reforms. So his transformation from businessman to social activist was a direct result of his personal tragedy. And Eduardo realized that he was not alone. Hundreds of families suffered from similar kidnappings, murders, and miscarriages of justice. So with his newfound public platform, he started advocating to fix the very system that had failed him. And Eduardo's work with Mexico United Against Crime involved campaigning for better laws, police accountability, and support for victims. And he became a recognizable figure in media, often speaking out whenever a high-profile crime case showed signs of foul play or injustice. And one major case he actually got involved in was the infamous Florence Causas affair, where a French woman was accused of running a kidnapping ring in Mexico. And Eduardo publicly criticized another activist, Isabel Miranda de Wallace, for manipulating public opinion in that case. Quote, "There's nothing more important than justice," and pointing out irregularities in the evidence. And his stance just showed that his commitment was to truth and fairness, not vengeance. And he didn't automatically side with victims if the evidence was shaky. He wanted the right people punished. However, Eduardo's vigilante-turned-activist journey was not without controversy. And in the years that followed, certain troubling allegations emerged regarding exactly how some of Paula's kidnappers were caught. Notably, Antonio, one of the convicted, claimed that they were tortured by individuals acting on Eduardo's behalf. And in a public interview, Antonio claimed that he was innocent and that he was brutally beaten and coerced into confessing that he had killed Paula's kidnappers. And he specifically named Eduardo Gallo as a complicit in the torture process. But such claims, however, remained unverified in independent and legal records. And yes, these claims do cast a shadow in the minds of some. Did Eduardo sanction or participate in extrajudicial actions beyond just detective work? And according to a detailed investigation by Los Angeles Press, Eduardo may have worked with a special police task force under a controversial security name, Genaro Garcia Luna, and was present during an operation where 6 suspects were executed without due process in 2001. And Eduardo, with this group, if true, suggests that Eduardo's pursuit of justice might have crossed into vigilante violence off the record. But Eduardo has denied any wrongdoing, maintaining that while he did have government support, he did not commit torture or illegal acts. And he acknowledges pushing the envelope to find Paula's killers, but he insists everything he did was aimed at getting evidence and handing suspects to authorities. So it's possible some police used excessive force while Eduardo turned a blind eye, or that suspects just pinned the blame on him to undermine the case. But what it does highlight is the complex moral territory he navigated. Is when the system fails and one entangles with less than scrupulous law enforcement to achieve justice, lines can blur. And Eduardo himself once said, quote, "The most effective form of corruption is the incorrect or incomplete formulation of the case. If they don't pull together all the facts, the charge remains weak and the case collapses," unquote. So in his desperation to avoid that outcome, perhaps corners were cut, but we do not know for sure. And despite these controversies, public support for Eduardo Gallo remains strong in Mexico. He was seen as a man who had been through hell and emerged fighting not just for his own daughter, but for all victims of crime. And in 2008, Mexico faced an epidemic of kidnappings and rising violence, and mass protests took place demanding action. And Eduardo was at the forefront of these movements, often meeting with officials and even presidents to advocate for policy changes. And as of the mid-2010s, Eduardo stepped back from the limelight somewhat, and he has resigned from Mexico United Against Crime and retired from public life, with little heard about him in recent years. But at the end of the day, if not for Eduardo, a dangerous killer, or killers, might still be free. But on the other hand, it also raises caution. Vigilante efforts, even well-intentioned, can spiral beyond the law, as suggested by the torture claims. And Eduardo's case fueled arguments both for and against vigilantism in public discourse. Today, Eduardo Gallo is in his early 70s, and his name still evokes respect among many Mexicans who remember the early 2000s crime wave. But Eduardo Gallo's story tells us that vigilante justice isn't always about pulling a trigger. Sometimes it's about doing the job others won't do at great personal cost. And his whole saga leads us to ponder, what would we do if the police and system meant to protect us utterly failed our family? Could we summon the courage, resourcefulness, and yes, the righteous anger to fight back like he did? I don't know. It's a whole moral question that I don't even know how to answer, and I just feel for these people so much. But we can definitely have a conversation down below in the comments. But that is it for today's video. If you want me to deep dive into any other stories, let me know down below, or even have a theme like this one, a vigilante justice, let me know down below. I always read the comments. And until then, stay safe, and I will see your beautiful face.